Well, it's really a pleasure to have Dr. Vincent Felitti with us today. And he came up all the way from San Diego just to be with us, which we're thrilled about. Many of you already know Dr. Felitti's work. He is the co-principal investigator or researcher of the Adverse Childhood Events ACEs study. He's an internist with experience at Kaiser. We heard earlier about ACOs are really about turning our medical system into Kaiser models. So exciting to hear that and get your perspective and background from your experience at Kaiser. He's also a professor of medicine at the University of California in San Diego. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Felitti. Thank you.
Thank you. I apologize for getting here late. The Amtrak stood dead on the tracks for an hour and a half. The title is a little unusual, The Repressed Role. This is a big issue. Everyone wants to hear about it. Somehow no one can use it themselves. So this is really rather striking, the intellectual interest that this attracts and the way it has been avoided in clinical practice. The study could be described as addressing the question that's implicit in these two downtown San Diego photographs. The question being, if somebody gave you this newborn infant with its extraordinary potential and said you had 19 years to develop it into this person lying unconscious on the sidewalk, overlooked by a world who is frightened by things like this, what would you have to do? How do you do that? Obviously, we know at some level because there is not a shortage of these people. The implications of this are enormous in everyday medical practice, in public health, in the costs of medical care, in social function, really in the economy of the nation. I'll tell you the big things that we found, really by accident, and then show you the evidence for them, that the 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that we studied are remarkably common, very disturbing to people, and hence are mainly unrecognized. These do not appear in medical records. They turn out to be powerful predictors of adult social functioning, well-being, health risks, biomedical disease, and premature death, and that combination of high prevalence and great penetrance makes them the leading determinant of the health and social well-being and economy of the nation. That's a fairly heavy-handed statement to make. I have no compunction making it. You'll see why. The study very really began with this person. I was an internist doing adult infectious disease work for a number of years. I loved it. I was asked to start a department of preventive medicine. Even though preventive medicine is a very low prestige item in medical practice, I saw it as having certain opportunities. In short order, we put together an obesity program using the technique of supplemented absolute fasting, which allows one to take a person's weight down non-surgically about 300 pounds a year. Hard to believe. We have lots of photographs and videos of doing that. Here's an example. This woman showed up in 1985 in our program, asked if we could help her with her problem. Our first mistake was in accepting her diagnosis of what the problem is. So you ask yourself, which picture represents the patient's problem? You're wrong. So we naively said yes, and in 51 weeks took her from 408 to 132 pounds and thought, well, my God, we've got this problem licked. I mean, we're going to have a world-famous department here. We were not smart enough to ask her the critical question, how old were you when weight gain began? It was only after her death that we found this photograph of her when she was 8. I mean, what happened here? Must have gone to McDonald's. Here's her weight curve. Looks sort of like an Olympic ski jump. 408 to 132. She stays there several weeks, and then in one 3-week period does what I had not ever conceived as being physiologically possible. She regains 37 pounds in 3 weeks. And I asked her, what's going on? And she said, I think I'm sleep eating. What do you mean? Well, when I was a kid, I used to be a sleepwalker. I haven't done that for years, but I live alone, and when I go to bed at night, everything's clean and put away in the kitchen. I wake up in the morning, boxes and cans are open, pots and dishes are dirty. It's obvious somebody's been cooking and eating there. I'm the only person, and I'm putting on weight. Okay, I never heard of it, but it certainly has a force of logic to it. But why now? I don't know. I understand, but what do you think? Why now? I don't know. I understand, but I want to know, why do you think it happened? I don't know. Yeah, he said that. And on the third pass, she stumbled and said, well, actually, there was this man at work. He was a much older man, you understand, doctor. He was married. And he said to me, hey, Patty, you look pretty good. You lost all that weight. How about you and me making it every week? And that was the day the sleep eating began. And I remember thinking, well, it's a pretty clumsy proposition, but this is 1986. It is Southern California. Why the extreme response? And pursuing that led fairly quickly to a lengthy incest history with her grandfather at age 11 and going on for about 12 years. Well, I was shocked because I naively thought incest was pretty rare. It's actually quite common. Of course, you would have to ask everyone to find that out. We do know. In short order, she's back over 400 pounds in a faster period of time than it took to lose the weight, and she disappeared for 12 years. 10 days later, somewhat similar case shows up, similar history. I'm blown away and soon started routinely inquiring about histories of childhood sexual abuse, and in short order was thinking, this can't be. People would know if this were true. It seemed every other person I was asking in our weight program had a history of childhood sexual abuse. I really resisted believing this probably for, many weeks. 186 patients later, I tallied it up accurately. It wasn't every other person, it was 55%. I had still some residual doubt, maybe I'm somehow creating a selection bias that I don't understand. So I got 5 other people to interview the next 100 sequential people coming into our program. They found the same thing. Presented this at a national obesity meeting in Atlanta. Was attacked by the audience. Some guy gets up and under the guise of asking a question says, you really need to understand, Dr. Felitti, that people who are more familiar with these matters, like obviously they, recognize that these statements by patients are largely fabrications to provide a cover explanation for failed lives. And I remember thinking to myself, do I tell this wretch what I think of him and start a riot, or just let it slide? I decided to let it slide. And there was a dinner that night for speakers, and the guy sitting next to me was from the CDC, and he said, look, if what you're saying is true, it's got enormous importance for the country as well as the practice of medicine, but nobody's going to believe your 286 cases, no matter how well you studied them. What we need is a large epidemiologically sound study with thousands of people. Wow, thousands. I was in charts up to my knees with my, with the group that I had. So we had an unusual department where 58,000 adults a year came through for very comprehensive medical evaluation. You know, more or less like what you see. You spend $2,000 going to the Mayo Clinic for a detailed evaluation, that kind of thing. It was a very unusual place. And so, yeah, well, you know, we probably could do that. How many people do you think we need? And yeah, 26,000. Yeah, 26,000. That sounds good. So our next problem then was getting this through the IRB. Because otherwise sensible people, when they saw our protocol for the study, were insisting that, you know, you can't use that questionnaire. You're going to cause people to decompensate. You may make occasional patients suicidal, etc. We spent 9 months arguing with them about that, finally got them to agree on the condition that one of us carried a cell phone 24 hours a day for 3 years to take emergency calls from people we were going to make suicidal by asking about their lives. Never got a call. Instead, I have a notebook of letters, largely from elderly women, one memorably summarizing the rest. She wrote, "Thank you for asking. I feared I would die and no one would ever know what had happened to me." So here's the study. This is the comprehensive medical evaluation system. We asked 26,000 people, 70% agreed to participate. There was no particular selection bias there that we could detect. I mean, we studied, you know, those who agreed and those who avoided in detail and could not see any difference. Average age 57, 80% white, including Hispanic, 10% black, 10% Asian. 73% had been to college, etc. It was clearly a middle-class population, you know, not some group across town that I don't see in my practice. Basically, it was you and me. Matching current health status here, determined by extensive medical history, detailed physical examination, extensive laboratory studies, against 10 categories of life experience in the first 18 years of life. And those 10 categories were selected because of their prevalence in our obesity program. And then we've been following them for the past 19 years. So now average age is in the 70s, matching what happened here more than a half century ago against current pharmacy costs, ER visits, doctor office visits, hospitalization, and death. And here is what we found. We have 82 publications out so far. The categories that we chose because of their empirical prevalence in the obesity program were major emotional abuse, basically recurrent humiliation. You are the stupidest kid I've ever seen. Or as a man told me recently, his father used to line him and his brothers and sisters up. You kids ought to just be taken outside and shot. 11%. Physical abuse, I'm not talking spanking, I'm talking heavy-duty serious beating, 28%. Contact sexual abuse, not somebody flashing a kid, 28% for women, 16% for men, 22% average for the group. Major emotional neglect, 15%, physical neglect, 10%, growing up in a home where one of the members of your household was an alcoholic or a drug user, 27%, growing up without both biological parents to the age of 18, both biological parents in the house, 23%, growing up in a home where someone was chronically depressed, mentally ill, or in the state hospital, 17%, in a home where mother was treated violently, 13%, in a home where some member of your household was imprisoned during your childhood or adolescence, 5%. That surprised me too. Struck me as very high. And then I remembered I know 2 physicians in La Jolla, one of whom is a national figure, who have sons in the penitentiary. Now, they don't talk about it, of course. but nevertheless, that's the case. We were dealing with mountains of information. We literally had over 400,000 pages of data between physical exam forms, questionnaires, lab slips, etc. We needed a way of simplifying this. We created an ACE score, which sums the number of categories, not events, but of categories that were experienced. In other words, if you were molested, 30 to 72 times, that simply was 1 point for the category, etc. So A score, none claimed, 33%. A score of 1 or more, obviously 67%. A score of 5 or more categories, 11%. So what that means from a physician standpoint is that every doctor in the country is seeing 1, 2, A score 5 or higher patients every day. They, of course, will not be recognized. I mean, my God, you can't ask patients questions like that. You're crazy. They'll be furious and no one will tell you the truth anyway. And there will be the most difficult cases of the day. We saw that women were 50% more likely than men to have an A score of 5 or higher, that if any category was present, there was an 87% chance of at least another category and a 50% chance of at least 3 other categories. So this is rampant. No one wants to know that. This is an interesting guy. He's a very bright man. An amateur psychopharmacologist in a way. Equally a semi-pro saloon fighter. In a different era, this guy would have been a cowboy. Today, he could be working on an oil rig, anywhere that keeps him away from home. When he was 2, his parents divorced. He never saw his father again. When he was 5, his mother remarried. For whatever reason, his stepfather saw fit to beat him pretty much every day. He comes home from school one day, and let me back up a sentence. He tells me that at 8 he's walking to school one day and the thought crosses his mind, nobody is ever going to be there for me in my life. When he's 20, he's imprisoned in Rhode Island for attempted murder. Comes home one day, finds his father beating his mother, his stepfather beating his mother, and impressively induces 5 long bone fractures and 1 skull fracture in his father, which, got him in prison for attempted murder. Gets out ultimately. Sensible and responsible guy. Works hard, is away from home most of the year. As I say, home is still not safe. And very responsibly sends his high paychecks home to his 3rd wife, a nurse who believes in him.
20 to 25 years drowning out some poor childhood experiences with drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. Gotten rid of the drugs, got rid of the alcohol. Next thing I got to get rid of is the cigarettes. And I had no idea that the nicotine played such an important part in keeping that door closed.
In keeping the door closed to?
The memories that I've blocked out with all these years with the alcohol and the drugs.
So you see what's happening to you now as related to what happened to you decades ago?
Yep. I found a way to block the emotions and the memories.
With?
Drugs, alcohol, cigarettes.
Sounds reasonably sensible to me. Don't you know that stuff is bad for you? Yeah, well, I've heard that, but it's good for me. It helps. Look at nicotine. This has been known for almost a century. Nicotine has potent anti-anxiety, antidepressant, anger suppressant, and appetite suppressant activity. I mean, part of the obesity problem we have in the country is that a lot fewer people are smoking. Well, no, I'm serious. Not only that, but those effects occur within 15 or 20 seconds of inhalation. The risks, which are very real, are 15 or 20 years away. And I think most of us have some sense, you know, ah, damn it, if I need help now, you know, I'll worry about 20 years from now next week. So this was another teacher. Shakes one's confidence in the conventional, trivial explanations of obesity, of addiction. Obesity being just one form of addiction being the unconscious compulsive use of psychoactive materials or agents. We used to have this painted on the wall where the weight program is. It's a big idea. You know, maybe the next cigarette will do it, the next drink, the next woman, the next mouthful. The conventional view, I used to believe this for years, that addiction is due to characteristics that are intrinsic in the molecular structure of certain substances. You know, supposedly you take heroin enough times, you're not going to be able to stop. What we found was just the opposite, that addiction correlates highly with characteristics intrinsic in that individual's childhood experiences. We'll start on the light end of things, looking at current smokers in an atmosphere notably hostile to smoking. I mean, I assume it's as difficult to smoke here as it is in San Diego. I mean, in San Diego, you can't even smoke on a public beach or a county park anymore. And yet, there's still a huge amount of smoking. I mean, you go to the Price Club or Costco, you know, do a good business selling cigarettes by the carton. Not only that, but in spite of the ever-increasing public health pressures against smoking, there has been no significant decrease in the past dozen years. That's kind of interesting. As the ACE score goes up, there's this stepwise dose-response curve. Wow. We looked at self-acknowledged alcoholism. The question we used was simple. Have you ever considered yourself to be an alcoholic? You know, we may be understating it a bit here because not every alcoholic wishes to acknowledge that. But this is rather dramatic. As the ACE score goes up, in a very strong relationship, the likelihood of being a self-acknowledged alcoholic goes up. We looked at self-acknowledged injection drug use. I'm only showing you part of the data here. I mean, it's pretty impressive as is, but ACE score 6 and higher doesn't fit on the graph without massively distorting the rest of the graph. At ACE score 6 and higher, this is a 10-fold increase. At ACE score 6 and higher, it's a 46-fold increase, a 4,600% increase in the likelihood as compared to ACE score 0. Now, the epidemiologists at CDC told me that those were numbers that they see once in a career. You know, you think the latest cancer scare of the week in the newspaper, there's an increase in prostate or breast cancer by 30%, and everybody goes nuts. And here we're talking 4,600%. A woman named Louise Robbins did a very important study in the closing years of the Vietnam War. She got almost 900 American soldiers to acknowledge to her, but not to the Army, that they had used heroin daily for the prior 30 days or more. Damn junkie, right? Upon return to the United States with no treatment. 8 months later, when she re-interviewed them, 94% of them were no longer using heroin. And it does not fit with the usual concept that I learned years ago. You know, take that enough times, you're not going to be able to stop it. Crystal meth. Everybody knows what bad stuff that is. Interestingly, nobody knows, nobody wants to know, that the first successful prescription antidepressant introduced for sale in the United States in 1940 by Burroughs Wellcome and Company, who then leased it to Eli Lilly, was methamphetamine. the very stuff which in impure form and unknown dose is sold on the street as crystal meth. And if you have any doubts about that, here's a full-page ad from the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1943 for the new wonder antidepressant methamphetamine. Amphotericin was their brand name. Does that mean anything? Yeah, well, one thing it means is that it's a lot easier to say, oh, my kid's on that damn crystal meth because there's a dealer on the next block, than it is to say my kid's buying antidepressants on the street. Really? Why? Go back to obesity. This guy lost 158 pounds in the program. Question is, why did he gain it? Well, when he was a little kid, his parents divorced. Again, another instance, never saw his father again. Mother had to work for a living, so he was sent to live with his grandparents. Grandfather was a pretty scary, violent alcoholic. And this guy started eating to feel better. And he used to get beat up a lot on the street also.
It wasn't that I ate because I was hungry. Yeah, it was, when I look at it, it was just a place for me to feel safe. As a child, I remember there was a point, I would probably say, all the way from kindergarten to, God, I don't know what grade, but I used to get beat up all the time. All the time. And when I got the weight on, didn't happen. Didn't happen.
So he makes the important point that the second way that obesity is protective, is beneficial, is that it's physically protective. You think of our expression, throwing your weight around. We had two guys back in the middle 80s who were guards at the state prison in downtown San Diego who came into the weight program, and they lost between 100 and 150 pounds each. They made no bones about it. They were not comfortable going into the prison regular size. They felt a lot better going in, looking big as a refrigerator. Throwing your weight around. So another example of how what we perceive as the problem turns out to be somebody's solution to problems that we know nothing about.
Ella H. started the interview by spontaneously commenting on the threat she felt when her psychiatrist recommended bariatric surgery to treat her obesity, and offered to sign the necessary paperwork to have Kaiser Health Plan pay for the procedure.
Can I get comfortable first? And then he says, no. He says, when drug addicts come, we take them off of drugs first. And he would take me off of my drug. Food was my comfort. Food. I coped with life with food. And it's really strange tonight. I guess the Prozac's helping, because when I'm taking the Prozac, I will lose a little bit of weight. And I just feel that he was taking away my safety. And so I decided not to even bring the paper to the doctor and have it done, because I'm not ready, I don't think, to get the weight off and know that I can't gain it back and can't be safe again.
You supplied me recently a lengthy autobiography, a number of dozens of pages altogether. And on the very next to the last line, you said something that I thought was extraordinary. Let me read it to you, because I think it's remarkable. I believe smoking 3 packs a day and weighing 300 pounds are not the problem. They're the symptom. took us a long time to figure that out here, and you just casually drop that as though, of course, anyone knows that. So you are in respiratory failure on 24-hour-a-day oxygen.
Yes.
Major amounts of weight, overweight.
Yes.
And you demonstrated, or we demonstrated together, a couple of years ago that when you had a major weight loss in the OptiFast program here, that your need for oxygen disappeared.
That's correct.
So that, if you lost 150 pounds approximately, the need for oxygen would no longer be there. The weight came back. Most people have very little understanding of why people get fat or regain. I mean, they're stuck with the simple belief, don't you know it's bad for you, etc. And people tend to know even less about smoking.
Yes.
It's labeled an addiction, and as though that somehow explains it all.
Right.
Etc. And you make this extraordinary statement about what we perceive as the problem really being the solution. Can you explain more about that?
Yes. I think I've come to that conclusion. It hasn't been quite immediate. It's come to me over the last few years of analyzing just exactly where I've been and what I've done. Obviously, I was a 3-pack-a-day smoker when I was thin. I didn't have a weight problem until after I was 35.
When she quit smoking.
But I've done several OptiFast type things, and I finally came to the realization on my own that the reason I put the weight back on was to protect myself.
So moments later, she begins talking about chronic depression. Most people speak of depression as a disease. Many say it's genetic. Some say it's due to a chemical imbalance, and there's something to be said for all of that. I'd like to propose a different idea, that what if depression were not a disease, but a normal response to abnormal life experiences? Here's the evidence for that. Using self-acknowledged chronic depression, women in red, men in yellow, matching that against A-score, the likelihood of self-acknowledged chronic depression, you see that at A-score 4 and higher, you're bumping a prevalence of 60% in women, 35% in men. Well, we figured some people are going to say, but yeah, what do patients know about diagnosing chronic depression, etc. So we looked at suicide. Oh, wow. Self-acknowledged suicide attempts. The completed suicides obviously were not in the study. Again, at A-score 6, it doesn't fit on the graph. It is so wildly off. At A-score 6 or higher, there is between a 3,100 to 5,000% increase in the likelihood of attempting suicide later in life as compared to A-score 0. These are numbers of extraordinary magnitude. We looked at rape, which I once naively thought was fairly uncommon. Very distinct relationship of rape in adult life to underlying adverse childhood experiences. Well, how does that work? Some people try to make this go, oh, that's blaming the victim, you're terrible. Yeah, right. How does that work? I think there's enough women in the room that you all have a good range of answers to that. And when you think about that range of answers, you realize that the applicability of them goes far beyond rape. We looked at hallucinations, the making of madness. And what we found is that at A-score 7 and higher, the prevalence of self-acknowledged hallucinatory activity is 10%. Whoever would know Of course, you'd have to ask everyone to find that out. And my God, you can't ask patients questions like that. Why, they'll be furious and nobody will tell you the truth anyway. We figured some people would try to make this go away by saying, yeah, but that's because at A-score 7, you know, to feel better, they're drinking or using street drugs. And that's why they're hallucinating. So we corrected for that in the pale lines, and you see the idea is the same. We looked at high-level promiscuity, which we arbitrarily defined as 50 or more lifetime sexual partners. Very distinct relationship. I slowly came to see that what this really represents is looking for love. Maybe the next one is the one who's going to care for me. And if not, surely the one after that. And if one can't solve this problem with peers, well, then there are photographs, pornography, children. You live in the country, farm animals. We looked at how this plays out with unintended pregnancy, usually brushed off as an accident, and we found that, as with most accidents, they're not totally accidental. Distinct relationship of unintended pregnancy or its treatment, elective abortion. More surprisingly, we found a distinct relationship of A-score to miscarriage of pregnancy. Wow, how does that work? How does what happened as a little kid affect whether I'm going to miscarry a pregnancy a couple of decades later? We'll come back to the point. In terms of biomedical disease, we looked at the relationship of A-score to liver trouble, hepatitis, jaundice. Well, okay, so that's going to be, you know, you shoot up on the street, you're going to get the hep, etc. So let's look at some other things. The relationship of A-score to heart disease. Well, we all know since the Framingham study that there are certain recognized risk factors for heart disease: smoking, cholesterol, diabetes, hypertension, etc. Most people don't know that about 12% of people with heart disease do not have any of the recognized risk factors. So how do they get it? And when we looked at them, people who have heart disease but don't have any of the recognized risk factors, we saw this distinct relationship to each of the underlying ACE factors. How does that work, though? Well, in recent years, it's become obvious that with chronic, major, unrelieved stress over prolonged periods of time, there comes the release of so-called pro-inflammatory chemicals, pro-inflammatory cytokines is the word sometimes used. And those things cause inflammatory changes in the lining of the smallest blood vessels, often causing them to close shut, turning off the blood supply to whatever piece of organ they were supplying. And those inflammatory changes in the larger blood vessels attracting the deposition of cholesterol, forming cholesterol plaques to occlude the arteries in a different way. The first patient I showed you, the woman we took from 408 to 132, died at age 42 of primary pulmonary fibrosis. Lungs turned to scar tissue. Never a smoker, no air pollution, etc. In recent years, it's become clear that some portion, yet to be determined in size, of primary pulmonary fibrosis is the result of the release of pro-inflammatory chemicals, turning the smallest vessels, closing them down, turning the piece of organ, in her case, lung, into scar tissue. Oh, this is a very interesting woman. She has 3 different kinds of cancer, not relapses, 3 different kinds. That's very uncommon. I had lunch with somebody recently who had 4 different kinds of cancer.
Can you tell just by looking at me that I was an abused child? Can you tell that I was sexually abused routinely, that I was neglected, starved, beaten? Probably not. You would have to ask in order to find out, and that's not the sort of thing that people typically ask about. The downside of having this kind of childhood is that it translates into health problems in adulthood. At least in my situation, it seems to have done. I'm now recovering from my third battle with cancer. Not the same cancer, 3 different kinds of cancer. I've had chronic pelvic pain, migraines, the whole laundry list of medical complaints, all of those sorts of things that are very difficult for physicians to figure out. Growing up that way instills a constant fear, a constant state of turmoil that's just under the surface of a veneer that's fairly thin. Little things become scary in an atmosphere like that, and once you've internalized all of that, it's very difficult to let go of it.
So what possibly, how could life experiences as a little kid affect whether you're going to get cancer as an adult? Well, you smoke 3 packs a day, okay, but she's not a smoker. So how does that work? Well, we've known the answer for some time, but never really thought about it. Pretty much everybody knows that if you get an organ transplant, you have to be on lifetime immunosuppression so you don't reject the organ. Many of you will have heard that one of the side effects of lifetime immunosuppression is an increased risk of malignancy. That's because we all are forming cancer cells every day, and our immune systems process them out in the background. So getting cancer means either that the rate of production is markedly increased, or the ability of our body to destroy just the normal low-level background production is markedly suppressed. So the question then comes, does it matter whether you get your immunosuppression out of a prescription bottle or as a result of chronic, major, unrelieved stress? So this shows up in all sorts of places where one would not even conceive of the plausibility of it. We looked at domestic violence. Now, usually women are supposed to be the victims of domestic violence. When you look at it more carefully, you see that they're about equal in perpetrators as men. It's just that the victims of the women are their children, who are not in much of a position to make that point clear, so we never really hear about it. We looked at how it plays out in the workplace. ACE score in terms of absenteeism, higher the ACE score, the greater the likelihood of absenteeism. ACE score in terms of self-acknowledged serious financial problems. Wow. I mean, what we're looking at there is poverty as an outcome, not as a primary cause. That's kind of an interesting point. Here, self-acknowledged serious problems performing one's own job properly and in relationship to underlying ACE score. So adverse childhood experiences turn out to determine the likelihood of the 10 most common causes of death in the United States. And we've been looking at the risk factors for the 10 most common causes of death in the United States. We've been looking at what causes the risk factors, which by and large tend to be coping devices for life experiences that we've all been taught as children nice people don't talk about, and my God, surely don't ask about. With an ACE score of 4 or more, the majority of adults have multiple risk factors for these diseases. The diseases themselves are dead. Many chronic diseases are determined decades earlier, not by disease as used to be the case, but by life experience. I mean, no one sees diphtheria posters nailed onto somebody's door by the health department anymore. I remember seeing them. You know, quarantines on a house. Nobody sees kids with beriberi, pellagra. Used to be common down south. Nobody sees kids with bowed legs from vitamin D deficiency anymore. It's been an interesting change. This is a big idea. This is why it's so difficult to treat. Because we're trying to get people to give up their solutions with no understanding of what goes on underneath that. Indeed, you could formulate this as a public health paradox, that many of our most common and intractable public health problems are unconsciously attempted solutions to personal problems that go back to childhood, that have been lost in time, and then are further protected by shame and by secrecy and by social taboo. Kind of a big conclusion. And we found that at A-score 6 and higher, life expectancy is shortened almost 20 years. When we looked at our findings, we were kind of surprised that the older people had lower A scores. And initially, well, it must have been things were better. Yeah, right. Ultimately, we discovered that the reason the A scores were lower in the older people was because all of the high A scores had died. So here's something to keep in mind in terms of trying to understand how this all works. These are PET scans, a very sophisticated kind of X-ray that depicts biochemical activity in color superimposed on anatomic structure. PET scans of the brains of 2-3-year-old boys, ordinary American kid, little kid taken from a Romanian orphanage, institutions known for being extraordinarily neglectful and isolating of the inmates that they had. And what you see is large areas of this kid's brain where there's no color, where there's no biochemical activity going on. And I don't think it's going to tax anyone's imagination too much to think, well, maybe that's going to somehow affect the kind of brain that's being formed at age 3. And maybe that's why this is all so difficult to deal with after the fact. It's summarized this way: this big base of individuals with adverse childhood experiences, we recognize now disrupting neurodevelopment, brain development very early in life, producing various kinds of impairment. Maybe this is the socially isolated kid, the weepy kid, the one who can't learn well in school. And when they become teenagers, they have enough freedom to try to do some things to help, and nicotine helps, and alcohol helps, and sex helps. Antidepressants on the street, known as crystal meth, help. But those all have their own problems given time. So given time, you see disease, disability, and social problems occurring. A number of people die early. The whole thing is lost in time, and then protected by shame and by secrecy. So if you ask yourself, well, what can we do? How do we use this? How do we get from where we are now to where conceivably we could be? Well, two basic things. One would be to acknowledge and understand that these problems exist. The other would be to recognize them in medical practice, where they show up very commonly, and where overwhelmingly they are unrecognized. Here's where the work was carried out. Since 1975, we've had 1.2 million individual adults come through for comprehensive medical evaluation on the top floor. And so, I guess around the year 2000, I decided we really had to integrate what we were learning into medical practice. I was running one department with a reasonably large throughput, so we entered all of these so-called trauma-oriented questions into our general medical questionnaire, 10 pages long, that people filled out at home before they came in. And when they came in, That questionnaire was taken and fed into a digital scanner that sucked up all the yes answers and reorganized them into a body system format. So we're asking questions like, have you ever lived in a war zone, been a combat soldier? Who in your family has committed suicide or been murdered? Very different question from has. Who in your family has had a nervous breakdown, ever molested as a child, held prisoner, etc. And this is from a real patient. This is what we would have in hand before even meeting this individual. You know, typical printout would be 2, sometimes 3 pages long. Patient has been physically abused as a child, verbally abused as a child, sexually molested as a child, threatened or abused by a adult sexual partner. She has difficulty controlling her anger, difficulty caring for herself, has serious problems with her family, recurrent abdominal pain. This is a quite obese person. I can't think of any diseases that combine chronic abdominal pain and obesity, etc. So this is what we know before we even meet a person, and it enables us to know ahead of time where we need to go further and not go with that individual. So in our old style of working, which I was really very proud of, what one would call a biomedical evaluation, 11% reduction in doctor office visits in the subsequent year. Wow, that's pretty good. In this new form, biopsychosocial evaluation, a 35% reduction in doctor office visits in the subsequent year, and this is a 130,000 patient sample, 2.5-year throughput for the department. I mean, this translates into billions of dollars. The outpatient budget for Kaiser Permanente in Southern California is $6.5 billion, LA and San Diego, just outpatient. 35% of $6.5 billion is big time money. This has gone nowhere. Not that anyone's rejected it. Nobody's heard of it. Really, it's very interesting. So final insights. Adverse childhood experiences are common and typically unrecognized. Their link to major problems later in life is strong, proportionate, and makes sense. They are the nation's most basic public health problem. It's comforting to mistake intermediary mechanism for basic cause. Well, the reason I smoke 2 packs a day is that damn cigarette company and their ads. That's what got me to do it. The reason my kid's fat is because of McDonald's, etc. That what presents as the problem may be somebody's attempted solution. Treating the solution may be threatening and cause people to flee from treatment. You've heard that people flee drug programs. Well, we've had a lot of people flee our weight program, but the interesting thing is it was the people who successfully were losing weight that were the ones who were fleeing. Drove us nuts. That's what led us into all of this. What the hell is wrong with these people? And what's called primary prevention, not trying to fix it afterwards, which is enormously difficult, costly, and improbable, but preventing it in the first place. No one knows how to do that, but it's the right problem to focus on, is presently the only feasible population approach. And most importantly, what we've seen is that change will be resisted by us in spite of enormous benefits. So a biopsychosocial and trauma-oriented approach to medical evaluation has been demonstrated to be feasible, affordable, and acceptable. I mean, we've done this on a huge scale in one setting that assuredly has not spread anywhere within a huge organization. It is possible to move from our current symptom reactive mode of practice to start dealing with basic causes, to also reduce the cost of care. And a trauma-inclusive comprehensive medical history is proposed as the routine entry mechanism into all ongoing care, be it medical, psychological, or institutional. If you want any more information, here are some sources.